Well, here to talk about great retreats in military history is Dan Carlin. He's the host of the Hardcore History podcast, which I couldn't recommend more highly. Hello, Dan.
Oh, thanks for having me, Mike.
Absolutely. So if we were to list the great retreats in history, first of all, before we even start listing, explain to me why that phrase isn't an oxymoron, great retreats.
Well, because sometimes retreating is an important part of tactical warfare. The Mongols, for example, all the steppe people, all the Turk horse archer types use retreat as a way to draw the enemy into a trap and to disorganize them. Retreat is something that can actually be an offensive tactic in warfare if you use it right.
All right. So if you talk about great retreats, I think you probably have to talk about Napoleon, an epic retreat from Russia.
Yes, and one that truly broke his empire. I mean, that was not a feigned flight. That was something that was an attempt at an organized effort that just broke down entirely. You know, they say one of the toughest things to do in warfare is to disengage contact with the enemy and then get away. And Napoleon's the most perfect example you can easily think of, where if you don't do it right, and was there ever a better general? So if he can't do it right, it's obviously difficult. And you just watch the French army disintegrate, the whole way home, and a tiny percentage of their original strength make it back to France.
Was it based on hubris or was it based on ignorance that he showed that the army marches on its stomach and so forth?
Well, I guess you could call it hubris. He had examples he could look at. He could look at Sweden's king, Charles XII, for example, who ran into a very similar sort of situation. But if you're Napoleon, and if you're leading the grand army of, 500 to 750,000 men, the greatest force ever assembled, it's really easy to blow off past precedent, isn't it? And just say, Charles XII was Charles XII, but I'm Napoleon, and I have a lot more people, and, we'll be able to do what Charles XII wasn't. Listen, this is how someone like Hitler is able to blow off Napoleon's example, right? You could just say that's not a real lesson because the variables have changed. But when you look at something like Napoleon and you watch that disaster, it does sort of tarnish the man's legendary image, doesn't it? Because you may do a lot of great things, but you lose a 750,000-man army in Russia, and tough to rank you up there with someone like an Alexander the Great or a Genghis Khan.
Right. And it's funny about hubris. I mean, we could say it was his undoing, but without hubris, what would Napoleon be? He could say, hey, hubris got me this far.
That's right. You have to be able to think of yourself as singular to begin with.
What undid him the most, besides the weather, the famous weather? Did the Russians use tactics? Did they understand their terrain better than he did?
They didn't play by the rules. There's a whole point during Napoleon's invasion of Russia where he's telling his subordinate commanders what the Russians will do now. We'll capture Moscow, and here's what the Russians will do, and all these things. And the Russians proved once again, as they've done many times in history, to be extremely unpredictable. And Napoleon would get very frustrated that they weren't behaving the way they should. But why can't you just admit you're defeated and we'll move on from there? And they did. They burned Moscow down around his troops. That's a pretty frustrating experience.
Yeah. It's like playing poker with someone who doesn't know how to play poker. They're the hardest people to play poker against.
Or someone who has a gun that will just shoot you if you win. I mean, it's a pretty, burn your own city down to keep the French from having any place to rest during the winter. That's old school toughness right there.
Yeah. All right, let's go on to another great retreat. What else would you nominate?
Certainly, we could talk about the famous Long March that Mao Zedong and the Chinese communists built into their whole mythology when, during the war with the Chinese nationalists, it's supposed to be several different retreats in the 1930s, but Mao and the communists were able to escape encirclement and get away to fight another day. And when eventually they would take over China in the late 1940s, they were able to point to that as a defining moment in their history and something that they could use as a rallying point to say that's the turning point when everything really changed. You could look at the U.S. in Korea in 1950, where we intervened in the conflict that had broken out between the two Koreas. It was really a proxy war during the Cold War, and we were pushing the North Koreans toward defeat, and then the Chinese communists, to tie that all in, come over the Yellow River, the Yalu, and push down, and our troops had to retreat when the Chosin Reservoir happens, and one of the really nasty retreats in U.S. history that eventually had MacArthur asking perhaps to use nuclear weapons against the Chinese.
So those are two different things in that Napoleon's retreat broke him, but Mao's retreat, the Long March, sort of made him, and he wasn't afraid to embrace that.
Truthfully, when you look at how the guerrilla movements after Mao would often use the tactics, it almost became like a little booklet for guerrilla movements. And the idea of strategic retreats was built into this whole asymmetrical warfare idea that guerrilla fighters had used all during the Cold War and even since in many countries around the world.
If we wanted to go to America, I would nominate a retreat that, in American history, it isn't taught because it's not a great victory of the Revolution. But if George Washington and his men weren't able to use fog to escape the Battle of Brooklyn, and that escape occurred on August 27th, 1776, I think there would be no United States of America, or at least it would have been delayed for a long time. And this deals with how countries think of retreats. It's sort of a necessary step along the path to a glorious battle. But sometimes the tactics and what you could pull off in a retreat are more glorious than a win when you actually have the overwhelming force.
Certainly, it is one of the biggest challenges great generals face on whether or not they can take an army that is fleeing in terror from the enemy, calm that terror, turn them around, organize them, and then make them a fighting force again. And that's something that General Washington, for example, was renowned for.
Right. To have led a retreat and then to be able to rally your troops again, that is a true test of leadership. Now, one of my favorite episodes of Hardcore History, a couple episodes, was the Genghis Khan episode, but the Mongols' tactic of the feigned retreat. Tell me how that worked.
It's an ancient tactic. The Mongols, as a steppe people, were inheritors of a tactic that went back all the way to, they're called the Scythians or the Cimmerians. These are ancient people that the Greeks and the Persians fought who used the same tactic. And there are wonderful old statuettes you can see of these Scythian archers turning around and firing their bows at the pursuing enemy so that they're killing the enemy as they retreat in front of them. There's an old line, I think it's either a Chinese or Islamic text, that said, "Do not pursue the Tartars when they flee." And the Tartars were another name for the steppe peoples because they're particularly dangerous when they run away. You get disorganized, you get tired, they shoot you the whole way, and then when you're all broken, they turn around and they fall on you.
Well, thank you for advancing this notion of retreats with us, Dan Carlin.
Thanks for having me, Mike. I appreciate it.
Dan Carlin is the host of the Common Sense Podcast and the Hardcore History Podcast.